Hello, this is my presentation about this door lock. It was created as a lock for the front door of a house, designed for people with Parkinson's syndrome. The shaking of the hands will make it almost impossible to fit a key into the tiny hole and then turn it. Therefore, I have decided to create a design that helps people with this syndrome. A key mostly uses fine motor skills, which is not optimal for this situation. Therefore, the main idea of my invention is to make a key that uses more gross motor skills than fine motor skills. There are several things I need to consider for this design. Firstly, it should be usable by people who suffer from tremors, so it should be graspable and large and have a lot of leeway for error. Second, I would like it to be mechanical, so there won't be any electricity. If it did have electrical elements, it could potentially run out of batteries and lock you outside of the house. Also, I think it would be difficult for me to properly design and make. Finally, the lock needs to be actually secure. This means it should not just be openable by jabbing a regular block of wood in there. To do this, I will have to add a slight restriction inside the lock that requires a certain shape of key, just like this. With all of this information in mind, I will need to come up with a type of door lock that is more accessible to the target audience. Luckily, I was able to take a small amount of inspiration from this lock from around 2000 BCE in an Iraqi palace. However, this design is suboptimal for this purpose because it uses fine motor skills. Therefore, I decided to create a new design. This was the first design of the lock I made. It's not accurate in terms of design and scale. It was mostly a visual to help me figure out how the lock would work. This black thing will go inside the hole and fit nicely into this slot. Then, these slopes will lift up these two gray things, which would allow this very light gray part to come out. This light gray part would represent the door in a real-life situation. In this diagram, it is clear that the light gray thing is blocked by the dark gray one, so they will need to be lifted up to allow it to be removed. This original design has several issues, such as the black thing being very difficult to place in, and the pins being difficult to properly maneuver blindly using only a key. Also, it is obviously a pretty inaccurate drawing and does not give me any measurements. So, I made this diagram. This diagram was drawn on graph paper, so the measurements are more accurate and give me a basis for making the 3D model. I have drawn this at a scale where one large square is 1 centimeter. This also has a few issues, such as the fact that these grips would intersect, and that I forgot to draw the frame on this side, but I fixed these in the final design. At this point, I had fully designed the mechanism of the door lock and I understood how it works. I had also provided accurate measurements for each section, so I went on to Onshape and designed the lock in 3 dimensions. Here are some of the steps. I made a few changes. Most notably, there is a longer base at the bottom, and I have changed the pins completely. The cylinder now only reaches halfway down here, meaning it doesn't need to be lifted as much for it to be completely out of the way of the light gray thing. This meant I had to add this extension. It also had a different shaped hole to hopefully prevent the pin from orientating in place. To improve the design, I have added tolerances, which add more leeway to the moving parts. Basically, if the measurements are exact, sometimes parts might have too much friction, so I have pushed these sides back. I downloaded each part as an STL file, which stores stereolithographic information about the model. Then, I used a USB to put the files onto a 3D printer, and I 3D printed them. Here is the finished prototype of the door lock. I will demonstrate it. This design is obviously not what it would actually look like in a real door. For example, it is too small. This means this handle on this piece isn't big enough to improve grip, but it probably would if the lock was bigger. Also, here's a time-lapse of one of the parts being printed. The lock is not perfect. It has some issues. The main issue I have noticed is that I gave too much tolerance to these pins, and they can now just orient in place. This is not a huge issue, but it could have been fixed pretty easily if I just used a better shaped hole or if I didn't add too much tolerance. Also, this piece represents what the door would be, but I could not create a full-scale one since it is too big. There would have to be some modification to these slots for that to happen. However, in its current state, it works quite well, even if I do it slightly inaccurately and fast. but I do think it can be improved further. I have already mentioned some of the minor flaws that are easy to fix, such as the size and the pin tolerances. It is not difficult to make the real thing bigger, and the pins can be fixed by lessening the tolerances. However, I think a way to improve this would be to make the pins go sideways like this, and place a spring on the other end. This would allow the pins to move properly and not be out of control. Also, it would still allow the door to open, but it would allow a small amount of leeway for the rotation. The springs I mentioned would have to be placed inside the wall, and the door would simply be connected to the mechanism like this. Finally, there would have to be a platform here with some slopes that make it easy to place the key in the slot while only using gross motor skills. With this arrangement, it is now simpler for people with this syndrome to get into one's house while still maintaining privacy. The main thing I've learned from this is that creating invention, or anything, requires many iterations of the problem. However, it is a good idea to just create the prototype if you can. Don't see failed prototypes as a waste of time. You wouldn't have known they would have failed otherwise.
Okay, yeah, thanks.